Hi, I'm Brian Horner, Curator of Collections from the Estes Park Museum. Today is Wednesday, April 30th, 2014. We are here at the Estes Park Museum with local climber Bronson MacDonald for the Estes Valley Mountaineering Oral History Project, a joint project between the Estes Valley Library and the Estes Park Museum. Okay, can you start out by giving us your full name, please?
Hi, my name is Bronson Noel MacDonald, and
go ahead.
I live here in Estes Park, Colorado.
Okay, were you born here in Estes Park?
No, I wasn't. I'm from a small village 7 miles north of Niagara Falls, New York. It's called Lewiston, and Lewiston is a cute little village right along the Niagara River, and we'd look out and see Canada a mile away.
What brought you to Estes Park?
I lucked out. My mother moved to Estes Park fall of my sophomore year of college. I went to Potsdam College in way upstate New York, and she called me up October 15th in 1991, and she's like, "Hey Bronson, I just moved to Estes Park, Colorado. Do you want to become a resident?" And I was just like, "Oh my gosh, yes." Like my dream came true. So I came out that following spring.
What was your first introduction to climbing?
So my first introduction to climbing was actually a month before my mother moved to Estes Park in the Adirondacks. Potsdam, New York is about an hour and a half away from the High Peak region in the Adirondacks, which is Adirondack State Park. It's state park in northern New York State. And I have 3 older brothers. They all had climbed before in the Adirondacks, and I heard about it. I read a little about it in the late 80s, early 90s, and I always wanted to go rock climbing. And when I was sophomore in college, I saw this cute guy walking across campus, and I knew he was a rock climber. I knew he was a climbing guide, and I was like, I want that. I'm gonna get it. I also knew he didn't have a car, and I had a car, so I went up to him, introduced myself, and I said, I want to learn to rock climb. I have a car, and I can drive. And so that was the start. And from there, we would go climbing fall semester. Oh gosh, we were climbing in the Adirondacks, 3 to 5 days a week. And then it got too cold to climb outside, and I wasn't interested in ice climbing. And there was one of the first climbing gyms about an hour and a half away, so from the Adirondacks in Glens Falls, New York. So we started going to this indoor climbing gym all winter, and I was totally hooked. So I really didn't do a lot of school. I passed with good grades, but I don't know how I managed.
So you said you were interested in climbing before you actually had a chance to go. What was it that drew you to that? What sparked that interest initially?
Well, growing up along the Niagara River, there's a ton of boulders on the Canadian side, and that area actually is a known bouldering area in western New York and southern Ontario. And there's some different rock faces on the US side that were taller, and I didn't think of bouldering. I mean, we used to scramble on these boulders just goofing around. But the rock faces, they were maybe like 50 feet tall, and I'd walk past them and I'd be like, "Oh, that's really cool. I want to experience climbing that." And then with just my older brothers, they all lived with climbers, all the old-time trad climbers of the Adirondacks that were putting up first ascents and trad climbing a ton. So as a little girl, I would go and visit my brothers and stay with them and meet all these climbers and hear about their stories and adventures. And I was always so intrigued, but never had the opportunity where I grew up until I went to college and I met this one guy.
How would you describe yourself as a climber?
Well, it's kind of funny to ask that. I thought a lot about that. I'm like, how do I describe myself as a climber? I kind of think I'm an average climber. I've been climbing for 23 years. I have a traditional base of climbing where you place gear into cracks and you rope up and you have somebody following and taking the gear out. But I'm much more of a boulderer and a sport climber. Back in '91, that's what I started off with was my first day of climbing was top roping at a little crag in the Adirondacks. And then the next day we did a 5-pitch route, and it was a slab climb called Chapel Pond Slab. I remember going up it and I'm just like, this is slab climbing, this is boring. And then the last pitch was vertical, and that's what totally struck me. I was like, this is climbing. And then the next day we went bouldering, and then I totally fell in love with bouldering. And I'm like, this is what I want to do. So I'm definitely much more of a boulder and sport climber.
Okay. How would you explain bouldering to someone who is completely unfamiliar with climbing in general?
That's a good question. Bouldering, to me, bouldering is climbing a short span of rock, and it's a very gymnastic-like movement. It can be anywhere from very less than vertical, so that'd be a slab climb, which there's big boulders that you'll see that are less than vertical, so it's a very delicate, it's like flowing dancing movements, and to way overhung roofs. So it's kind of, to me, like the purest form of climbing because you don't have ropes or harnesses. It's just you and the rock in a short span, and you're trying to create a sequence to get from the bottom to top and finish it all in one go. So it's very gymnastic-like movement.
How is that different than more traditional climbs or sport climbs?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's different because you really are not getting high off the ground. You might get anywhere from 5 feet to, you can get 20 feet off the ground, but you're never up super high. So like trad climbing, you'll have a harness and rope and gear, and you might get up 1,000 feet, and you have a climbing partner that's following and cleaning your gear out of the cracks. And sport climbing is usually single pitch, so it's maybe anywhere from 50 feet to 80 feet long. It could be 100 feet long, but in a sense, half a rope length, where there's permanent protection on the rock. And then you clip into the permanent protection on the rock and then clip the rope that's attached to you and your harness into that. So bouldering is just you and the rock. And if you go with a climbing partner, you have somebody there spotting you, like when you learn a gymnastic movement, if you're a gymnast, and the spotter then, if you fall, helps direct you to a crash pad. So you do have a piece of gear. You have a big full mat that's maybe about 6 inches thick underneath of where you're bouldering, so you don't land on the rocks or land on your butt and on the dirt. It just helps prevent future injuries as you get older.
What was your first introduction to climbing in the Estes Park area?
That is a good story. So I moved to Estes Park in spring of '92, and I was 19 years old. Estes Park is definitely traditional based because we have the Rocky Mountain National Park. I mean, we have huge rock faces. And the climbing community here is a lot of guys. There's not very many women. And 1992, there definitely were not very many women here. So I moved to town, and I was working at a coffee house behind MacDonald bookstore. It was then MacDonald Coffee and Paper. And my mom also worked there. And she knew I was having a hard time finding climbing partners. And I was kind of shy, and I just didn't want to go up to people and be like, hey, I'm a total beginner rock climber. Will you take me climbing? So she met these two guys. One guy was named Brett, and the other was local climber Jim Hurst, who doesn't live here anymore, but he's put up a lot of different things in this area. And she went up to them and said, hey, my daughter, she's a climber, and she's looking for climbing partners. And it was so funny because she said, yeah, my daughter climbs 513. And these guys are like, whoa, yeah, we want to climb with her. I'm a total beginner. I mean, I climbed for maybe 8 months before that, but it was very little. And I've done one trad climb at that point, and I knew how to do basic things. But so we exchanged phone numbers, and they got in touch with me. And it was so cute because Jim, after he started communicating with my mom about what my levels are, what I've done, he realized, he was like, wow, this mom has no idea what she's talking about. But she's 19, she's a cute girl, I'll be interested. So we met up, and it was great because he became one of my climbing partners for a couple of years. And from there, he introduced me we climb at Lumpy Ridge 5, 6, 7 days a week. And then it was cool because I mentioned to him that I really liked bouldering, and he was getting into bouldering in different areas in the park, and he mentioned this one area up in the park at Emerald Lake. It's Emerald Lake Boulders. So we started going up there and exploring and developing that bouldering area. And a good friend of mine from high school, he knew I moved here, so he called up my mom, asked if he could crash in her driveway in his VW van. And so us three would all just end up going up to the park and going bouldering. So it was nice because it was just like a couple locals, and I met one girl who kind of liked to climb, but it was kind of quiet and tough to meet a lot of climbers when I first moved here.
So then you met up with these couple of local guys and kind of got in with them. They started showing you around. Were there other climbers at that time that you ran into that mentored you as well, or that were regular climbing partners?
Well, not necessarily locals. I mean, there was Lawrence Stumke, who doesn't live here anymore. He has put up a ton of sport routes in this area. He worked for Colorado Mountain School back in the 90s. I met him, and that was kind of it. Jim Hurst, Lawrence Stumke, and then my friend Michael Laurenti, who was from high school, and he moved out here. It was kind of like us, and then there was people infiltrating in and out for the next couple seasons. And then the guy that actually taught me how to climb in the Adirondacks, he was living in Oregon that summer, and we kept in touch, and he actually moved to Estes Park, and he became one of the people in the climbing community. He was, Jim Belser is his name, and he was definitely my main mentor, and he has done a huge development of bouldering in this area. But it was pretty quiet. I mean, I definitely met Mike Caldwell and his son Tommy, and Tommy at that point was, I think, 13. So as a 19-year-old, I didn't really hang out with 13-year-olds very often, so I knew of Tommy, and he would come bouldering as he got older with the little group of us, but it was still really quiet. I knew of all the Tim Hansen and Steve Comito and Doug Snively. I knew of all these great legends of the area that are probably 20, I'd say about 15, 20 years older than me, but I didn't really ever climb with any of them. I just climbed with a couple people. But slowly, more people started moving here, and the climbing community started getting a little bit bigger, and that helped a lot to meet more people.
Were there some climbers that you maybe never met or didn't get to climb with that you kind of looked up to or were inspired by?
Oh, definitely. Climbers, they get totally hooked on reading Climbing and Rock and Ice, and we're all like junkies reading this. And I became inspired by Lynn Hill and Bobby Bensman. Those two women were in the 80s and 90s, and Catherine Destiville, she's a French woman. And then Robin Ebersfield, she was originally from Georgia, but all those women, except for Catherine, they all live in Boulder, and they definitely were like my heroes and idols in the women's scene because they were doing things that I couldn't even imagine. And eventually I met those women, and I guess it would have been 2 years after I started climbing, I met Bobby down at Waco Tanks State Park, which is outside of El Paso, Texas, and that's a world-renowned bouldering area. And became friends with her and started bouldering with this woman who's just amazingly strong. And so definitely those women were my heroes, and I would read about them in the magazines. And the climbing community is like any little outdoor group, or, there's pilots, there's fly fisher people or fishermen, and cyclists that all have little communities, and eventually start getting to know everybody. And it's pretty neat when you start meeting your heroes. But also just reading about all the top climbers back in the 90s, like the competition climbers, and like Jim Carn and, oh my gosh, and Jason Carn. They lived in Oregon and did things in Smith Rock, Oregon. And there's just a whole list that you're like, wow, I want to meet them all one day, and that were very inspiring.
How would you describe your progression as a climber from your very first day out as a beginner to kind of where you're at now?
Well, that's pretty cool. I'm a lot stronger. I have a lot more technique. The progression is there's still the same drive and passion and desire and love for climbing. I mean, that progression hasn't changed. Like the minute I touched rock when I was 18, and from trad climbing to top roping and then bouldering has still stayed the same as today. Physically, the progression has just expanded immensely. I mean, the training scene from the early 90s to the present day is so drastically more excelled, learning how to prevent injuries, how to become a better climber with using the useful tools of indoor climbing gyms, and modifying different lifting techniques. So the progression is, my love stayed the same, but I definitely got stronger lead head, not as scared about taking falls when you're leading with a rope. And that's kind of, I mean, that's a wonderful progression, not being scared. But the progression, still this physically stronger.
What is it about climbing that still keeps you excited, 2 decades into it?
Wow. Well,
is there any one thing you can put your finger on, or?
No, and there's not one thing. I think it realistically is, it's the whole scenario of being outdoors, the freedom of movement on rock, even driving by, like driving up right now Route 7, you look at all the rock, and then there's so much rock out there that you're just like, I want to go touch it. Even like if you see a little boulder on the side of the road that is maybe like 10 feet tall, you're like, oh, I wonder if there's something there. It encompasses everything, the adventure, the traveling, going to new places in the world to see different climbing areas. The community of climbers is so diverse and warm and hospitable that no matter where you go, you will always meet wonderful people that totally bring you in. They'll be like, yeah, let's go bouldering, let's go sport climbing or trad climbing. Anywhere you go in the world, when you go into a climbing community, that local climbing community, they're always warm and welcoming. So it's everything about climbing.
What are some of your favorite areas to climb here in Estes Park?
That's a good one. Well, Estes Park area it's pretty diverse in the types of styles of climbing, and the rock is primarily all granite, but there's different types of granite, and I would have to say that Emerald Lake Boulders is probably one of my favorite areas. It's kind of neat because different seasons, I prefer different climbing areas more than others. Like beginning of the season to get back into, after the winter, getting back into shape, maybe go to Wild Basin Boulder, Boxcar Boulder. And it's just a single boulder. It's a great place to go by yourself if you don't have a partner because it's all flat landing. And going up to Lumpy Ridge, except for this winter, because it was pretty heavy winter, you can boulder there all winter. You can even trad climb there in the wintertime because it's all south facing. Lumpy Ridge is kind of like the old staple where you want to hone your technique and really tear up your skin, get it beefy. You go to Lumpy Ridge. It is so crystally, and it kills your skin. And then there's neat because there's so many other areas that keep getting developed, like Elkland area just right off of 34. And it's in the park, but you park off of Route 34 and you hike in, and beautiful boulders. And people have gone there maybe 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and now it's getting more developed. I mean, there's places down 34, like Mary's Bus is a really fun place to go sport climbing and easy access. So I guess for me, it really depends on the time of the year and what my focus is, but it's really, really special.
Have you had a hand in some of the bouldering development in the area?
Just a little. I guess the primary thing that I had a hand in was carrying crash pads in with the guys that were doing all the first ascents. all the hard first ascents. I've done a few easy first ascents, like lower grades, and exploring and trying to find new areas. And I'm always, like in the 90s, I was always out there with the guys, all the guys doing all the developing. And I didn't put up a lot, just a few boulder problems. And then sport and trad routes, I just repeated all the classics that have been put up. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I wish I could repeat all of them, but. So my influence is just a little bit. I was the nice girl that hung out with all the guys. That was always warm and hospitable to everybody.
What was it like hanging out with the guys, trying to develop new bouldering areas? Did sometimes people have an idea and let's go hike this direction, or was it more haphazard?
You know, I would have to say it's a little bit more haphazard, because definitely, we all would go exploring, hike up to Chasm Lake. People would be climbing the Diamond, and then hiking into Hallett's Peak. Actually it's kind of neat because all the trad climbs are all these big stones, and you're going to be past boulders. So it was like a lot of word of mouth. Emerald Lake boulders, that was, probably all the old timers, all the first people that climbed Hallett's, they all saw the boulders a little bit, but they never went and developed them, because bouldering is much more classified as, something to do on your rest day. It's not something you do on a great climbing day where you're fresh. All the old timers are like, oh yeah, bouldering, it's just like something you goof around with. But then it's developed into this whole new, its own sport in a sense. And so a lot of times you just go hiking and exploring and looking at topographical maps. You're just like, there has to be a bunch of boulders in this area. And a lot of times you just luck out. Sometimes you're like, wow, this is really cruddy rock. Other times you're just like, this is bomber rock. Why haven't we ever seen this before? So it's just a lot of exploring, taking initiative.
How would you describe the climbing community here in Estes Park, both when you first arrived and today?
It is a lot different today. Back in the early 90s, it was a very small group. There weren't a lot of younger generation people moving here to go climbing. A lot of them, they would all live in Boulder or Fort Collins. People would travel and pass through. But the ones living in Estes Park were like, it was a great group of all the local old timers in a sense. And with the progression of sport climbing developing and bouldering, people suddenly realized how great this area is. So definitely at first I noticed when I moved here with being so in love with bouldering, a lot of them were just like, oh, bouldering. They would put down boulders. A lot of people did. And it continued to be like that for a long time. Some of the hardest boulder problems in the country were getting set here in this area. And this area is world-renowned bouldering location with Emerald Lake, Lake Iaha, which is also Chaos Canyon. Things at Lumpy Ridge that were going up that were just extremely difficult. Some boulder problems I've only seen a couple of ascents, and those went up in the early 90s. So it was interesting to see the whole progression of how a lot of people, local climbers, were they'd turn your nose to you. And you'd say, yeah, I want to go bouldering. You want to go bouldering? And they're like, no, I'm going to go rope up. Nothing wrong with any of that. It's all climbing. But today, the climbing community here is, I think, a lot more open to all forms of climbers. It's a lot more diverse. There's climbers here that only boulder. There's climbers here that only trad climb. There's some climbers that only sport climb. And then there's some of them that do everything and intermix and ice climb and mountaineer and alpine climb. So today, I feel like it's a lot more welcoming and communal. and easier to find climbing partners. Still really hard sometimes, especially if you're a new person, to find climbing partners, but it's getting a lot easier.
What about female climbers in the area? More now?
Oh yeah, there's a lot more now. It's kind of neat. So my best friend Melissa Strong, she started climbing here. I moved away for a few years, and after I moved away, she started climbing, and then I moved back, and she started off trad climbing, and now primarily only boulders. And it was wonderful because when I moved back, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I have a great girlfriend to go bouldering with. And I've always climbed with guys, and a few girls here and there. And today, there's Melissa, me, my friend Quinn Brett, who is an all-around climber. She likes to trad climb, sport climb, boulder, pretty much trad climb primarily. And then there's some girls that come and go, like our friend Carla. She'll sometimes climb, then she'll go for a few years without. Off the couch, she's like, oh yeah, I'll go do that. And so today, there's a lot more women. The younger generation of girl climbers is definitely growing, but there are mainly, a lot of them are gym rats. And it takes them a few years to get outside and find the passion for it. But overall, there's definitely a lot more. And then there's a lot of girls. The climbing community for women has grown so much with the accessibility of climbing gyms. And there's a ton of women from Boulder and Fort Collins, Golden, Denver, etc., that are good friends with a bunch of us up here. So they come up, and we all boulder. So you might be hiking up to Emerald Lake or Lake Hiaha to Chaos Canyon, and you'll see a group of girls with crash pads on their backs, all going bouldering, not a single guy with them. And it's so nice to have that opportunity. Whereas 22 years ago, there'd be me and Jane Gordon. And Jane Gordon's actually a park ranger, I think, for the National Forest, Roosevelt National Forest. But it was pretty much her and I, and back in the, and then there definitely was older women that climbed, but didn't interact as much with the younger generation. So I think that's definitely changing a lot. It's nice that there's a ton more women and girls of all different age groups that are climbing together.
Do you think climbing primarily with the guys had a significant impact on how you progressed as a climber, or maybe some of the things that you did or tried?
Definitely, I think so. Watching them be much more dynamic, excelling. Men, of course, have a lot more upper body strength than women. And my main climbing partner, Jim Belser, he always focused on amazing technique, footwork. If you have great footwork, you'll be able to do anything. Your upper body will get strong, and eventually you'll be able to become more dynamic and have more power. But watching men climb, especially the really talented men, that their overall technique was brilliant, it gave you an insight like, I can do that, I can try that, I want to try that. And also most men don't have fear, where a lot of women, I think it's just innate in women to have a little bit more fear, because we're the ones who are supposed to have babies and kids, and you always are like, oh, well, we got to be careful, So hanging out with the guys makes you a little bit more aggressive, like, I'm going to try harder. And that definitely, today, women climbers, the younger generation, like teenagers and girls in their early 20s, are so much more aggressive. So that's a progression. I think women from the 80s and 90s are to today slowly, like, have become way more dynamic, powerful, and just realizing I can climb just like a guy. I can climb just as hard as a guy. And all the guys that I've ever climbed with, the neat thing about them is, some of them were some of the best boulders in that time period in the country. And they were just like, of course you can try this. The only way to get stronger is get on these hard boulder problems. So it was nice to have that influence.
Do you have some specific goals or projects that you've kind of set for yourself over your time climbing, and that you were really excited that you achieved them?
Definitely. I still have goals that still haven't achieved. It's funny, I always had a goal when I was younger. My big goal is not to get injured, so I slowly progressed through the grades. And then during different time periods in your life, you may have different things where you can't train as hard, you won't be climbing as hard, you just plateau, which is normal, I think, in any athletic endeavor. And I always had a goal that, okay, by the time I turn 40, I'll finally climb my first 513. So I put that pressure on myself the summer before I turned 40. And different life events happened, so I wasn't able to. And I'm just like, well, you know, I'm still in my 40s, I still can achieve that goal. And so definitely I have the goal to achieve is to climb some beautiful 513 sport routes and to boulder V10. And the cool thing is I work full time and I have other projects that I'm doing in life that will end up leading to a different career for me that I've always wanted to do. So you kind of sometimes have to put something on the back burner, and climbing, it's slowed down a little bit right now, but once you become passionate about something, it will never leave you. So I have a couple more months where I have to really focus on another thing, and then I do have a climbing wall in my house, in my living room. So that's kind of nice because I can always be training and stay strong. But yeah, the goals are still to always keep doing new stuff that I've never done before at all different grades and keep pushing myself to get to harder stuff.
Do you have a story of a specific climb that you did that you're especially proud of, or?
Oh, I like that. I'll keep it local because I've traveled all over the world for climbing and have really neat experiences in different areas. But local, probably my most significant experience, and it's not technically the hardest thing I've ever done locally, but memorable experience was on Twin Owls on the east side is a little place called Hen and Chickens, and there's a route there called Hagakure, and it's this beautiful line. There's a couple fixed pitons, and it's just a single pitch. It's maybe 50 feet tall. It's not very tall, but I've top roped it a ton, and it's a trad line, and it's little gear. It's run out a little. It's kind of spicy. It's very spicy, and I've always wanted to lead it. I had it wear it on top rope, and I was just like, ooh, do I do it? And so I would try leading it, and then I've fallen on a couple pieces, and I was just like, okay, no, I'm not ready yet. And so I hadn't been able to do it from the bottom to top yet. And then one day I was just like, you know what? I didn't have a climbing partner. I knew how to hike around back and set up a top rope on the top. I'm like, I'm just gonna rope solo this. And I talked to a couple of friends because I never had rope soloed before. I'm just like, okay, I'm going out by myself. And then at this point I already had climbed, going on like 18 years. Or no, maybe like 15 years. And so, should be able to figure this out. I've experienced. I know all the safety measures. And so I went up there and I set up the anchors, made sure everything was, balanced properly, super strong. I think I had like 8 pieces in for my anchor because I'm like, I don't want anything to fall out. I want this to be solid. And then I fixed a line and tied it off so it was I have a dynamic rope, but so it was like taut, so I could just make sure everything is fine. So I tied off one end, and then I had a gree hooked up to my harness, which is not technically the safest way to rope solo, but it can work. And I rope soloed it with no falls, and I was just like, okay, I can do this. And that was more scary than leading it, because it was just me trying to figure out all the equipment. And you're double checking everything. There's slack, you're pulling up. And you're in weird positions, pulling up slack through your gree-grees, so if you fall, you only fall like a foot. And after that, I was just like, okay, I can go do this. So the next week, a friend and I, we went out. She put me on belay, and I led it, fell once, came down. I was like, okay, let me just chill out for a second. And then I just sent it. So I sent it, meaning I red pointed it with no falls. And that route was just beautiful. It was kind of like, really, did I just do this? So, and then, that's in our backyard. So that's the most memorable.
So you've been climbing for a while now. How have you seen the sport in general kind of change over that time?
Well, definitely there's a lot more people. The climbing community is huge. And that would have to be with the opening of gyms. I think there's a gym in every city now. Even small little rural cities, somebody will have a little climbing wall somewhere. So with the accessibility of people getting into gym climbing, that then leads to people wanting to go outside and try outdoor climbing. There is quite a bit of difference because gym climbing is, technically it's a lot more safe than outdoor. Everything is obvious. The routes are all labeled with tape mark. It's a much more controlled environment. So with that, the climbing world and community has grown a lot. And then you'll have the people that are interested, they want to learn more, and they might go with a group or get guided outdoors, and then they fall in love with that. And then they start learning how to climb outdoors. And so with the trad world and the sport climbing world, that hasn't progressed as fast as the bouldering world, because bouldering is a lot more feasible and accessible, also financially easier to do because you have a crash pad, shoes, harness, and a chalk bag. You don't have to have a harness and your rack and all ropes and everything. So that definitely has become a lot more populated. The attitude towards climbing, I think, has always been positive, but the younger generation today seems a lot more communal and supportive of one another. And also, climbing difficulties continuously grow because, back in the 80s, 70s, 5'11" was really hard, 5'12". The guys back then were so strong and they're putting up hard stuff, not really realizing. And then it continues to grow and grow. People see, they can visualize a blank face. There's like, oh, there's 3 holds there. Of course I can climb that. It's just, the vision continues to grow and get bigger. That's just going to lead to more areas getting developed, and the climbing population continues to grow because it's just more accessible.
Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between climbing indoors versus climbing outdoors? You mentioned how everything's more obvious in a gym. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, in the gym world, it's kind of like called plastic. All the holds that are bolted onto the wall, they're a form of plastic climbing holds. And a person can put up a route in a gym with specific shape, size, climbing holds to create a specific level or difficulty of climbing. And from everything from 5.0 to 5.14 in a climbing, and then bouldering indoors also, you can have from V0 or V0 minus to V12, 13, 14. So it's the indoor climbing world is very much more manufactured construction. Like you can go up to a wall and you see all the holds, and then there will be different colored pieces of tape that mark the route that you're going to climb at that specific level. And so say up to the wall and there's a bunch of yellow tape all by these holds, and let's just say that's 5.8 or a 5.10 or a 5.12 route. You'd be like, oh, today I want to climb 5.10. So you just go and you do that route. And so with that, the indoor climbing, it's kind of like a grid in a sense. You're like, oh, okay, I can just go do that and that. It makes sense. So climbers who start in the gym, everything is so visual with colors, and that when they go outside, I mean, real rock doesn't have little pieces of tape anywhere, and you have to find your own holds. So indoor climbing is pretty neat. It's definitely its own little world. A lot of climbers only climb indoors and never go outdoors. Indoor climbing also has a huge competition scene, and that's world-renowned. You have from the youth division to the masters, and it's pretty neat because it gives lots of people opportunities of all different levels of climbing to be able to compete, to climb indoors. And also indoor climbing gyms are everywhere in the world today.
Speaking of competitions, you've had some involvement with our local climbing team, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
What was that like, working with the younger generation and those kids that probably started climbing indoors?
It was a lot of fun, first of all. I first started part-time with some of the local coaches, and one woman, Michelle Herney, she ran the climbing program, and Stefan Greenway ran the climbing program here at our local gym, the Estes Park Mountain Shop. And it's really neat, they've had world-renowned climbers come out of their climbing team, like Tommy Caldwell and Paige Clausen. I mean, they're the best climbers, some of the best climbers in the world. So helping out with them, part-time coaching, was a lot of fun with the head coaches, and coaching with the younger kids and watching them climb, teaching them how to move. It was really neat to see the progression that these kids had this opportunity to go climbing. They have an opportunity to learn, because that didn't really exist, definitely didn't exist to climb indoors in the 80s. It started in the early 90s. So with my involvement in it, it was just fun to watch the amazement that the kids had when they were just like, oh, I can figure this move out. They would be daring. Some would be much more timid than others. And then eventually, for 1 year, I was a full-time coach. I took over with the team, and at that time period, the comp circuit, so there's this thing called the USA Climbing. It's this huge national comp circuit with different climbing teams. There's regions. So in a sense, it's just like all the other team sports that we have. Soccer, you have traveling soccer teams, leagues, and etc. The climbing world for the youth has grown so much that that's now the kids' main sport, is climbing. Instead of going and doing a bunch of team sports, they're on a climbing team. And the local climbing team was very interesting because these kids go to a small school, and all the coaches at the high school and the middle school are trying to get them to do track, soccer, football, basketball, volleyball, baseball, softball. I mean, these poor kids are being pulled every different direction. And there was only a few kids on the climbing team that just did climbing. And a lot of them which is good to be multi-sport kids, but there was some that realized, I just want to climb. And so those kids on the climbing team, those were the ones that would go to the local climbing competitions, and then a lot of them made it to divisionals, nationals, and some of them made it to worlds. So it was really neat to see there's a very select crew that wanted just to focus on climbing, and then you had other kids of other abilities that wanted to experience climbing, but not necessarily have that become their main sport and push it. So when I was a coach for a year, the USA Climbing, the kids throughout the entire country are strong climbers. So the competition scene is getting way more competitive and stronger. I mean, you have kids that are competing in their on-sighting 513, that's their warm-up. And it was hard to have the kids at our local area who are they're kind of being pulled all over the place. Go into competitions and excel, and there's only a few that always will excel. So it was interesting to watch that and see how much the progression of the climbing competition scene has changed. So the local climbing team, we had it where there would be kids that just want to do it as a fun thing, rec, and then some that wanted to train. And I kind of feel guilty because I grew up playing soccer, and we were one of the best in our state. So I grew up from a pretty strict training background that I expected all the kids on the climbing team, I'm like, you're gonna train hard. You know, if you wanna be on this team, this is what is expected out of you. You have to try. I wanna see you try. I'm not here to baby you. And so I feel like I'm like, oh my God, I'm like my soccer coach. I was just kind of mean and brutal at times. We would warm up, I'd make them go run. And they're just like, we have to run before climbing? I'm like, yeah, you guys we need to warm up well. You need to be physically active. You need to get the juices flowing. And so I would go running with them. And I'm like, if I beat any of you, you're doing this again. And so it was interesting to see how much the climbing kid scene has changed, where it's so much more competitive, and you can't expect that out of every kid. So it was kind of hard for me to find a balance, but I loved working with all the kids because they were all there because they wanted to climb and they loved it. The ones that just were like, yeah, I don't care if I climb 5'5", that's fine. I just want to, have fun, make it to the top, or do a couple moves on a boulder prom. It was neat to see that they were trying. And then it was really neat to see the kids who became so passionate about it that they would ask, how else can I become a better climber? What do I need to do? And in today's climbing world, climbers are cross-training. So I had the kids go to local kids CrossFit, which we have a great kids CrossFit program here. And because they need to be balanced, they need to work all the opposing muscles and prevent injuries. So it was really neat to help them explore and see that they can always be a climber no matter what level they're at the rest of their lives, to the ones that, if they want to be super strong and be competitive, this is the next level they need to go to. And it's sad to say, though, that the elite climbing team doesn't exist. There is an after-school program, which is nice that still exists for the local kids, whoever wants to get into it.
So I guess recently, I'm not sure how recently, but there was a bit of discussion about a local bouldering area that was sort of a local spot, and then it got publicized online on one of the forums. Were you involved in that at all, or can you speak to kind of the differences of opinions that climbers have about that sort of stuff?
It's interesting that you mentioned this, because this has been happening ever since bouldering has become so much more popular. This happened back in the 90s with different areas getting developed. Today, with the internet, it can become national news throughout all the different forums. It can become a huge topic and much more known in the public, in the media. So in a sense, it's nothing new, but I know of a couple different events that have been happening in the past. Really, it's been, I moved back here in 2002. I had a short stint away. So in the past 12 years, there's been some different areas that have become a lot more popular. We have people from Japan and Europe and South Africa, like world-renowned climbers coming here. Then we have a ton of people from the Front Range coming up here to Boulder. So I can't really speak specifically about the forums, because it's been happening for a long time. And there's always going to be this controversy. It's controversy of access, that these boulders are going to ruin the access for other boulders or local boulders to their area. Nobody owns any bouldering area, which is it cracks me up. I'm like, you guys, this is a national park, or this is national forest, this is BLM, this is state, this is my backyard, whatever. It should be all open and shared, and I think a lot of the times people forget we need to educate each other to respect the land, don't go off trail, don't be stupid. And people are always going to try to bend the rules a little bit. If you bend the rules, fine, but just don't get caught. That's the biggest thing. And it's the ones that get caught that ruin it for everybody else. And that's, a lot of times, I think a lot of the problems are people are leaving crash pads places. People will even forget their crash pads. But if you're going to do anything that's against the rules, then you do your hardest to make sure nobody ever finds out. And that's like anything in life. If you're going to break some rules, you get away with it. And I know a lot of locals were annoyed with even people from Boulder and Fort Collins coming up to different bouldering areas. but we go down there to their bouldering areas. So it's just stupid, I think, how pissed off people get. They're like, this is my boulder, and it's like, no, it's not. We got to all share. Just make sure you just then communicate and be friendly, and let's make sure we respect the trails, the land, the park, the rangers, the locals, communicate with everybody so we can keep the access. That's the biggest thing, because the minute you have all these forums going in, controversy, the park can just say, you know what, screw you guys. We're going to shut this down. So we just all have to make sure we communicate well and keep the access. So I think that's going to be a controversy as long as people are climbing. And it happens also with sport climbing areas and trad areas. You know, people always want to find the shortest distance to get to areas too, if it's off trail. And we just have to make sure, as climbers in the climbing community, to educate everyone that this is what's happening. Do not leave this trail, because you don't want to mess it up for other people in the future or next week or whenever. So that's kind of my opinion on that whole forum scene.
Well, it's interesting, because it seems like every few years there's a big disagreement about something, and then people sort of figure it out, and you know, the sport progresses, and then something else comes up and it gets figured out, and then it progresses. And so it's really interesting to looking at the timeline of things that we've been looking at, and this seems to be one of the latest ones.
Yes. I try to stay away from all those forums. I'm just like, goodness, you guys. It's gonna happen in 20 years from now too. So
yeah.
No.
If you were limited to one area that you're allowed to climb for the rest of your life, where would it be?
Anywhere in the world?
Any local area. Yeah,
local
like
area.
if you were somehow restricted to one of the local spots, which one would it be?
Spots. Wow. Well, thankfully I can say the Rocky Mountain National Park, because it has a lot, and that's one designated area, the Rocky Mountain National Park. But if you have to be much more specific, like one little area, that's a tough one, because there's so many cool places. But if I had to continuously that was like my one boulder, I guess I would have to say Emerald Lake. The bouldering, I mean, it's just beautiful, and it's like a little cluster of boulders all together, and it's fun, it's diverse, and beautiful scenery, and you have water right there. That's really cold, but yeah, I'd have to say probably Emerald Lake boulders.
Do you have any other stories or experiences of climbing in the area that you want to share with us?
Well, gosh, there's so many good stories. I mean, there's so many fun times thinking of hiking up with just different friends, and you know, your daily just being goofballs and silly, and I guess you caught me off guard a little bit, because there's so many stories. Man, I mean, I can think of some stories that the public shouldn't probably know about, like hiking up. Well, I'll tell you anyways, but you guys can edit this. But it's always entertaining hiking up to Emerald Lake or Lake Hiaha, Chaos Canyon, with your crash pads on your back. And all the tourists are like, whoa, what are those? Especially the tourists back in the 90s. Today, a lot of tourists are like, ooh, those are bouldering crash pads. And you're like, yes, it is. But back in the 90s, people would be like, whoa, what are those things? Are you camping? And you know, the crash pads, I'm only 5'3". So a lot of times the crash pads are like 4x3, and that's almost like my height. And they'd be like, whoa, what are you doing? I'm just like, oh, actually it's a pop-up tent. We're just gonna go up and pop it up. And they're like, really? That is so cool. You're like, yeah, it's a heavy pop-up tent. Like, I'm gonna carry this if I was going backpacking. Or I'd be like, oh, it's, a raft, we're just going floating. A lot of times we would always tell people, we're like, oh yeah, it's the Rocky Mountain humping pad. And they're like, what? We're going up to film a porno. This is the pad that we filmed the porno on. And it's great because then they're just like, oh, okay. And, it's so sad. I mean, sometimes you just get you never know what's gonna pop out of whose mouth. And, it's that, a lot of the times of just hanging out with all your friends and being silly and telling stories to one another and entertaining the tourists, those are a lot of the most fun times. And going up to, it was pretty neat I remember my first summer here in 1992 going up to Emerald Lake with Jim Hurst and Michael Laurenti and a few other people, and we're bouldering and just trying these boulder problems, and they were just so hard. Today they're like piece of cake. They're the super easy warm-ups for people. I mean, the level has progressed so much. But it was just so much fun. Like, we'd go up there and, we were the first people to really boulder this one bouldering area. And we're walking up there and people just look at you like, what do you have on your back? And why are you going that way? The lake is this way. And we're like, oh, we're just gonna go check out some big rocks. And people are like, don't really understand. What, you mean you're not going to that big rock to climb Hallett's Peak? We'd be like, no, we're only climbing something that's only 10 feet tall. And just hanging out up there, sunbathing, bouldering, it's all integrated together as just one big, huge experience. So, I'd have to sit here for a while and think about some really, really good stories, but just all the moments.
Well, what is it like to know that you were one of the first people to explore some of those boulders, and now there's so many other people that are getting that similar experience?
That's kind of neat that you say it that way, because it's kind of like every boulder, even if it has boulder problems on it that people have done, if it's your first time there, it's a brand new boulder problem. It's a new experience to each person every single time. And to go there, maybe back in the 60s, there were some different people that actually bouldered at Emerald Lake and put up all these boulder problems but never wrote about it, never publicized it. Maybe it's already been done, but I believe, after talking to a lot of locals, we were the first ones in this one area. And it's a neat experience because you know that you are contributing to the bouldering history. And you're experiencing something that nobody's ever really touched before. And you're cleaning the rock with maybe like a toothbrush because there's dirt on it. There's, you always want to make sure that you clean things not to damage the rock, but to make sure that you can grab a little edge. And then you sit down and maybe you work it, meaning it's a sit-down start and you're on the first hold and you reach up to the next hold and then you fall. And then you try it again and your feet are on some little teeny edge. And then finally you figure out a few more moves. And then you figure it out from the bottom to the top and you don't fall. The experience to do that it's kind of mind-blowing. It's like the first time you learn to ride a bicycle. And you're just like, oh my gosh, I don't have training wheels. I'm riding a bicycle. I'm doing it. It's the same experience. It's adrenaline rush, but bouldering to me is not adrenaline, like dangerous adrenaline, like, base jumping and stuff like that. That's crazy, but that's really cool too. But it's the same rush that you are putting something up that other people are going to enjoy. They might not, but usually they do. And it's the first time something went up, as long as you believe it's gone up. But you know that it might not have, maybe in a couple of years, maybe people will forget about this one little boulder problem and somebody else comes back to it a couple of years later and there's no chalk on it. And then they do it. And it's kind of like that's their first time experience too of setting a new boulder problem. But when we would go to different areas, like there's a place down Route 34 called the Beach. And it's seriously right next to the Big Thompson. You have to cross the Big Thompson. It's this one little rock overhang. It's about 8 miles down. It is on private property, so we always would try to respect. And the beach, it was so cool, like developing that. And people would drive by, and word gets out that you're developing a new area, and there's hard boulder problems on it, and you send it, you're just like, wow, I finally got that one. Or, you know, you go and check it out, and you're like, is this worth checking out? So it's like any new experience you have in life, and then you're just contributing to the climbing history. And you know that somebody else will always come and try it, and hopefully they enjoy it as much as you. So I think that's my impression of like why it's so cool to put up a few new things, or be there when somebody puts up something new at any different level, because you're all contributing to the history.
Cool. I think that's all. So thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.